If I wanted to write a whole book this year, what would I do? The first thing that I would do is test the idea or test the concept. And what this might look like is testing a scene or testing an idea that you might have in the form of a scene or even a chapter. What I would recommend, though, in doing this and kind of using this as your starting position is that after that initial scene or whatever the concept is that you had in mind comes onto the page, is to go to the very beginning and see what kind of hook and then what kind of lead you might be able to create. It's good to sort of test your story by creating this initial hook to see what are sort of the things or what is the thing that is going to initially grab your reader's attention and make them interested in this story or this idea. After that, we want to see what is going to be the thing that pulls them through the rest of the story, being our lead. Usually at the very start of a book, there is some kind of hook or inciting event or something that grabs the reader's attention. Then after that, there's an element that the reader sort of sticks around for. Sometimes this can be something like an interesting setting or concept, while other times, and most often, it's the characters or the story around these characters that we are reading about. After sort of coming up with this lead and understanding what our leash is, try writing a scene or two. Is there something there? Is this an idea or a concept that has sort of the chops or enough meat on it to be a full-length novel? Or is this maybe better as a short story or even just a smaller element to a larger story? This might also help you think of what else can be added or contributed to this idea. The test is really the first step in seeing if this is a story that is worth pursuing all the way to the end, or maybe something that was just a good concept but might be hard or we don't really know how to execute it fully. The second thing that I would do if I was starting at ground zero on a new book or a new novel that I was working on would be to know the path that I'm on and build some kind of roadmap. You don't need to be a hardcore plotter. And quite honestly, my opinion on the plotter and pantser binary is one of specific and personal distaste. I feel like the whole discussion around plotting and pantsing has become a little bit corrupted along the way, and we've kind of lost sight of the plot. I'm not saying in this step that you need to plot out your whole novel. Actually, kind of the opposite. If I were to be working on a book from scratch, I would like to kind of know where it is going after I've tested the idea or even the concept. It's essential to have a plan, to know where we're starting and then some of the important beats along the way leading to the end. The key to achieving our writing goals is having a plan and not just working on the same project or even writing ourselves into dead ends for years and years and years. We want to get this book done. We want to write this book in a reasonable amount of time. Again, this doesn't mean that you need to be a hardcore plotter or that you need to know every beat of the plot and even every beat of your character's arc. But you should know the high points and the highlights even of your story and the path you're going to take your reader along. There's a balance that I would try to strike between creativity and structured planning. And this would just be a tool to help keep track of the story and in knowing where we want to go, so that we can better set up our story and have moments of fulfilling payoff. If you found the video helpful so far, consider leaving a like and even subscribing, as it's a good way for me to know if these videos are helpful and if you are getting some value out of them. The next thing that I'd be doing is then testing those high points and those beats. Now, this will be where I would probably start really kind of digging into the actual writing of the story. But instead of going linearly, I would more so jump around to the important beats or the important moment. Sometimes, too, it would be good to go with the initial sequences and chapters or even scenes that initially sparked this idea for whatever this writing project might be. Trying to write the climax of the story or even some of the pinch points and other bits of conflict would be a good way to sort of start and see if there's ways we can improve this story or if there's enough tension there already. A method that I've become a big fan of that I've been using for a lot of my longer form work is what I have been calling the short to long method. And in doing this, I essentially plot out or map out how many chapters roughly I want there to be in the story and limit myself to writing only one scene for each of those chapters. This way I sort of get the first draft down on the page. And when I go back, I have something to kind of build off of and contribute to. It also helps in creating a sort of natural progression in understanding where the story was and where it is going. A lot of times when we are getting sort of lost in the writing process, we can sometimes lose sight of the things that we want to set up and when we are paying off some of those initial promises. Even just figuring out what the key moments are after doing our summary and going back and summarizing even those chapters or those scenes, or writing just those chapters or those scenes, is a good place to sort of start to break up a lot of the heavy and daunting task that is writing an entire novel. And again, if you don't want to do this or don't necessarily have an affinity towards plotting or sort of mapping out where your story is going, you can of course always write the scenes and the chapters that might come easiest to mind or easiest to the page. That way you can still get the benefit of progressing through your story while not getting stuck on a certain scene or chapter. And next on our list is something that I would suggest, even if you are not starting a new story right now, that you start doing immediately. And that is to start coming up with comp titles and even a log line. Essentially, what a comp title is a comparison title. This meets that. It has the elements of this story or this movie or this book, but the characters are more like this movie, this story, or this book. And when we talk about log lines are essentially just a very, very brief description of your story. This usually is the selling point or the essence that you might try to pitch to either an agent or a friend or any individual that might be interested in your story. I found this actually helps and is a good reference when you're in the midst of writing and even revising. It makes you think about the essence of your story and how you might want to market it or even pitch it later on. Knowing some comparison titles and having an idea of how you might summarize the entire project will also help you in not straying in your own story or writing yourself into dead ends. I've also found it is a lot easier to come up with a pitch or conceptual overview before you've actually written the entire manuscript. How hard is it to conceptualize or come up with a pitch for an idea as opposed to an 80,000 or 100,000 word manuscript? The next thing that I would probably do is, once we've sort of developed some of the basics to our story, being the summary, even having some outline and maybe even written certain parts of it, is I would probably start to look for a critique partner or some feedback on the story in general. Brainstorming with a fellow writer, a friend, family member, or even a spouse that will give you good, honest feedback and critique can sometimes be the difference between a project becoming something great or a project sort of toiling and spinning and sort of losing focus. This process can also maybe help you come up with comparison titles if this is something that you're not very good at either. You can also test out and see if some of the ideas that you've put on the page or are considering adding into your manuscript are actually good ideas, or if they are sort of better ideas and harder to actually implement into a story setting. Sometimes a fresh perspective can help you enhance your story and add elements that you might not have added otherwise. or remove elements that you might have chose to include but shouldn't have. The people that are kind of early in this process might also make for good beta readers down the road when your manuscript is done. The next on the list, and getting towards the end, is probably one of the most important next to actually writing your story, and that is to set realistic deadlines. This might be something that's hard for us to do, or might even cause a level of stress and anxiety around. But it's hard to hold ourselves accountable to a goal or finishing something like a book without having a real deadline in place. I know for myself, this made a huge difference this past year when it came to setting my goals and reaching them, and setting my goals and not. Deadlines kind of help either put a little bit of artificial pressure on you as well that might bring out some extra creative energy that you might have needed in a dire situation. It's also a good way to look and see if a project is actually completable. You can look at what you need to do every month, every week, or every day in order to reach a goal of finishing a manuscript. A lot of people make it a goal of theirs to write 1,000 words a day. And if you did that every single day, you would have written 365,000 words in a year, which is much more than just one novel or even 2 novels. But with that being said, we shouldn't put a huge amount of pressure on ourselves if we don't hit these writing goals. The goals are there to be flexible, but to also hold us accountable. I would look at a calendar and see what is a realistic goal, or what is a realistic and achievable goal that I can hit to help me reach the ultimate goal, that is finishing a book. And the last thing on my list, which is something that I preach and practice through and through, is embracing the revision process. When you finish writing a book, it is not finished. That book should probably go through a few rounds of revision. And these can be self-revisions, or these can be actually hiring somebody or working with another writer on revising your manuscript. Also, don't be afraid to skip around if you're having scenes or even chapters that are particularly difficult to write or that just aren't coming to you naturally. Part of the revision process is coming back to these places and building them out, making them more fleshed out, and even setting up maybe something we didn't set up before. Sometimes things become much clearer as we write around it or even develop the story in a kind of splotched sort of way. We see how one element might mold and mix with another, and then when we write that centerpiece, it fits like a puzzle piece. I've always seen the revision process as the process where the real writing comes out. It's a process of polishing not just your prose, but the story in general. I don't think I've ever worked with another writer or written something myself that after a round of revisions, we've come out with a worse story. But remember, you can't necessarily revise what you have not yet written. That you need to first have written something or have gotten something on the page before we can go back and start revising it. These are sort of the 7 things that I would do if I were to be starting a book or wanting to write a book from scratch. These are all things that I implement and use and tell others to implement. But is there anything that I left out? Is there something that you would do or that you have found particularly helpful in writing your own book? Let me know in the comments down below. That's all to say. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.